Hi, this is Pete Flitzer from Around the Galaxy. Luke, the Easter egg placement in Andor has arguably been the most subtle of all the live-action Disney Star Wars, but it's also had some of the deepest cuts. How do you work with the story group to make sure fans of the lore are served without excluding the casual fans?
I think it's more about just making sure that we don't start from a basis of it being fan service. So it's like it's it's not the first thing I think about. I think the best way to answer that is like there's a lot of us on the show, and we're a good mix of people who have worked on Star Wars, who are Star Wars fans, and people who have absolutely no context of Star Wars. And so within that, we're all filmmakers. So we're trying to make environments that feel correct in the context, that everything's there that should be, and that tells a story and gives us a very kind of character-based environment. And then within that, like, okay, so what can we put in from Star Wars that not reminds us we're there, but actually would be there in that environment, in a Star Wars galaxy, rather than try and slip things in for fun. So Lucen's Gallery is a very good example of something where every artifact in there, the whole collection needed to work together to tell a story of lost culture and interesting artifacts from across the galaxy, of which some things are there that we can recognize from previous movies or shows or whatever. So I think that's more the approach. It's like never are we led by that. It's more about just things that would be that enrich that environment on that level should be there. Does that make sense? Is that a good answer? I don't know.
Completely. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, Luke. I'm Gustavo from Triad of the Force. And my question had to do with Coruscant and the designs that had to go into Coruscant. Because when we go into that planet, we see that there's three main areas that we're telling our stories in. It's Cyril's mom's apartment, the ISB, and then Mon Mothma's apartment. And I feel it's a really big contrast, this Coruscant that we see in Andor versus the Coruscant that we saw in Attack of the Clones, which was very bright, saturated colors, lots of neon, and it was a very welcoming environment. And when we see like these three locales, it's quite the opposite to an extent. There's brutalist architecture, very minimal modernism, and then some Art Deco and Mon Mothma's apartment. So what was the process of design to like do an anti-Coruscant, so to speak, that then framed the themes of each character's story?
You've almost answered your own question there, but I think this is a good one for Michael to answer as well, because I think what he did with the costumes in Coruscant was phenomenal. But so but okay, so basically. I don't think, I mean, I'm not a massive fan of how Coruscant looked in the prequels. So, and I think the thing with that is it's just environment background. So what we wanted to do, it's literally the hardest thing, and I could talk for hours about why it's hard to do. And if we're going to do it, we have to do it well. So, and you don't want it to, every environment in Coruscant to be told via CGI, led element. So, and equally, when you're composing those CGI shots, you don't want them to feel like they wouldn't exist in a real world. So the kind of core principle of Coruscant is its height, its verticality. It's 3 miles high, and its sort of dichotomy is made up of literally told, the sort of upper at the top and the middle Coruscant, the lower kind of in lower Coruscant. We don't touch on lower Coruscant that much. So it's then it becomes character led, which is interesting. So, and then you want to look at cities like Tokyo and New York, and like what is the language of a vertical city, and what makes that interesting. That's kind of the approach. So it was never about trying to make Coruscant look like Coruscant or Ralph McQuarrie's Coruscant or anything like that. It should smell like that. It should have that nostalgia, but it should fit in Star Wars. It shouldn't feel futuristic or sci-fi, and yet I want to understand it as a real place that could exist, and equally we don't necessarily need to always be away from it. We want to inhabit areas within it. So it's really complicated, but essentially the principles are materials, like it should be monochromatic, it should be concrete, it should be steel, it should be glass, it should be things like this. It's hard, it's inhumane, there's a total lack of organic material there, and you just sort of make these decisions and you build it up and you realize what starts to work and what doesn't work. And then Edie's is a great one, because I mean the idea behind it is like, I reckon she bought that apartment 20 years ago. She had a view across Coruscant, and then the whole city grew up around her, and it got lost like she did. and it's got that kind of Baker-like cream versus, say, the clinical sterility of the ISB, or Mon's sort of, it's kind of like Mon's place is almost like an embassy building that was given to her. So it's got values of her Chandrilian culture, and yet also it's got these sort of lack of I don't know, comfort that brings with Coruscant. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I really do think you should ask Michael that question, because I think we both talked a lot about that planet in particular.
I think from my point of view, we did what we do on all planets. You know, Luke and I would talk really deep dived into the culture, and we wanted to build actual, real, authentic societies, and not just like random colors and textures for each planet. But we thought about, you know, the culture, what materials and technologies would they have? How is it a stratified society? Is it a unified society? You know, we thought Coruscant would be very diverse. There would be people from all over the galaxy there. It's the seat of government. There's a Senate there. There's all sorts of embassies. But within, we also go deep into the core of Coruscant. So we see the different societies. We see the people that might, you know, service the buildings, the lower Coruscant. We go deeper and deeper until people are engaging in more nefarious activities. And so we wanted to represent that entire spectrum of culture. It's not like you just go to the rental house and you buy 6 of these things and you dye them different colors and that's your culture. We just wanted to think about every background player would have a backstory and a reason for being on screen.
Hi, I'm Chase, aka That Gay Jedi, and Michael, my question is for you. I remember hearing a story that you had about Amy Adams and her character in American Hustle, and sort of this stain that you came across and found in a vintage dress that ended up becoming sort of a perfect story moment for the script and for the story. So I was wondering if there are any happy accidents in your costuming process for Andor.
Ooh, that's a good question. Let's see. Happy accidents. I mean, I think it was actually a little bit. There weren't actually so many accidents on this set, were there, Luke? In the sense that everything was much more. There was this endless discussion and thinking about things. So I think it was. American Hustle was very of the moment and organic, and let's just give this a go. But when you're working in the Star Wars universe, everything really has to have a logic and a reason for being on camera. You know, there's going to be a lot of scrutiny over every square inch of the frame, as you guys are very familiar with this concept, and so you want to make sure that things are there for a reason. So I would say there wasn't so much accents, but just lots of deep thinking.
Thank you.
Hi, I really love the prison arc. I think Narkina 5 is very different from what I think most people would imagine a prison to be. It's bright, it's clean, there's no bars, there's no real guard presence, yet it's still completely oppressive. So how did you design the prison and the costumes, the entire look, to sell this idea that the inmates are being constantly monitored when in reality, nobody's listening? And what does the design of oppression look like to you?
That's a really good question. And the prison for me was always like a cross between an abattoir and a laboratory. And yet also is like a labor camp, essentially, that you can't escape from. It's like Alcatraz, but if Alcatraz was a lab. So I just find that more interesting. I mean, it would, right from the beginning when we talked about a prison and we looked at panopticons and things like that, and that logic of how we could make the organic material of the people be the thing that turns the machine. They're the disposable element, was what that came from. So I think it's just way more interesting to go with something more sterile and stark. It's more sinister, it's more creepy, it's more THX 1138, which was a good reference which we started with for the prison. So then say something grungy and obvious for a prison. I think, I don't know much you've seen, but as that builds, that story, it will make more sense as well. Again, it's I actually really love making white sets as well. I think they photograph beautifully. I think things pop more. I think they have a sinister nature, which I think is was just, I don't know, it just felt more interesting for that part of the show when you look at how we break down these blocks and, you know, the earthiness of Ferrix against the sort of organicness of the highlands, which is like our version of the desert, and then this kind of trapped sterility of the prison. Yeah, it started there and then it evolved, and I know Michael is the same, really. I mean, like, yeah. Sorry, Michael, carry on.
I think for us, Luke and I sort of talked about, you know, how do those who wield the power, like the Empire, how do they use environment and color to oppress and intimidate and disorientate? And I think this palette of white on white is like, there's nowhere to hide. It's quite horrific. You lose your sense of depth because all you can see is white on white. So it's you're disempowered by this soul destroying environment. So we spent lots of time also developing a fabric that felt very utilitarian, disposable. It feels like they just peel them off at the end of the day. They're treated like cattle, hosed down, sterilized, and then they're given a fresh one for the next day. So I kind of like all of these tiny little details that would eat away at you psychologically as a prisoner. They were sort of brought into the details of the costume.
Thank you.
Hello, Luke and Michael. This is Sarah and Richard from Skywalking Through Neverland.
Andor's got such a great visual style. Very, very unique. It's Star Wars without being Star Wars. How close did you want to get to what we've seen already in Star Wars? And what motifs did you know you wanted to work in when creating the world of Andor?
I don't think we ever started that way around. I think when I first met Tony, it was almost like, okay, we're going to make a Star Wars show, but it's not going to be like any Star Wars show that you've watched, kind of thing. So, which is exciting anyway. It's just challenging. It's really hard when you start realizing that means going into people's apartments and checking out their bathrooms and going to work with them. And so what do we want to keep? I think it was more like keeping the tangibility of the original 3 movies, and then looking at Rogue One, the sort of grittiness of that, finding a sense of modernity that could compete with other shows, and also make work with the drama and the writing of what Tony puts together and the character-led sort of drama, but maintaining the sense of nostalgia that I think Star Wars holds so well, without wanting it to become like, and I'm not saying other shows do this at all, but that was partly a fear. You know, it's very easy to slip into selecting things as if from a catalog of Star Wars in order for it to just feel Star Wars. I don't think any of us ever wanted to do that. I certainly know Michael and I didn't want to do that. It was about enhancing what was there and then fleshing it out to make it feel like you really could walk and live in this universe with these people, and hopefully forget about it at times, forget that maybe you're watching Star Wars, and then be reminded now and again. That was kind of the goal anyway.
And Michael, for the costumes, if you could weigh in, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I think we knew as soon as we read the scripts that we would have to take a new approach to our creating the visuals for this project. You know, all of Tony's characters are so, you know, detailed and complex, messed up. You know, they couldn't afford to be just like 2-dimensional costuming. Every sort of detail and layer had to be thought about. You know, the choices would be practical, character driven, and not ornamental or added on. So, which really worked for me, because that's the way that I love to work as well. But there was certainly, you know, what incredible established costume language there is for Star Wars already. 40 years of incredible design of some of the most talented costume designers on the planet, sort of contributing their vision to the what a Star Wars world looks like. So it was, you know, amazing to have an opportunity to have my own take on that world. And so we wanted to definitely, you know, use the presence of things like the established uniforms and the armor to ground us really firmly into the Star Wars world. They would do a lot of work for us to sort of show the audience that, yes, this is a world that they knew. But then that gave us the opportunity to leap off with some of our other characters and try some new ideas and show audiences some new compelling and surprising costume ideas.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Brandon from Talking Bay 94. It's great to talk with you both. I would love to, one of the things that stands out to me from other Star Wars things is we see a lot of personal rooms and personal belongings in this show, right? And I think it's kind of a cross with a lot of these characters, right? You see Cassian's room, you see Cyril's, you see all these like actual personal belongings. And I'd be interested with both the production design of it all, but then also feeling comfortable in someone's apartment with the costuming and with actually like laying out how someone is in their own home rather than in an ISB or in a security office. How do you approach that? And what were you trying to communicate with some of these characters when we delve into their personal lives?
I mean, like any project, I think you try and get a sense of the character into the space. So I think sort of Marva's, for example, the idea behind that was you had the sense of a home that was fully functioning, you know, when Cassian was younger, when she raised it, and he's grown up and he's kind of grifting and she's lost her husband and the business is shut down, and there's that sort of centralizing around her chair. That's her world is literally getting smaller and she can't cope with the place. And it's like, and then I was saying with Edie's apartment, I think, you know, it's almost like she bought it was box fresh. You could get upgrades and plugins to the apartment, and then over time it's aged and become a bit more Baker-like over time. And I mean, Rebecca as well said does a really fantastic job of just sort of getting under the skin of what people would have, because we can't have paper and we can't do the normal sort of texture of life, so we have to be very selective and actually more thoughtful. Like, so in Edie's, we're really hooked into this idea that she has this home salon in the corner, which you never see in season 1, but it's there. And she sort of, it's like a Star Wars version with a sort of like hairdo kind of setup. You know, all these things that actually feel relatable, and yet also in a Star Wars language. I think, you know, it's an endless conversation. It's a fantastic question, actually, but it's always character. It always starts from the character.
And I think from my point of view, I agreed. I have to chime in with that. It starts with the character. And I mean, the joy of working with Luke is that I feel like you design spaces like the character would design the spaces. It's like you think so much about who they are and what they want to project with their interiors. And I try to do the same with the costumes. So, you know, if it's the difference between wearing something tight and structured and how that makes you feel compared to something like layers that you can disappear in, like we see Cassian at the beginning disappearing into his clothes, hiding. Then his arc throughout the series is to become closer to the hero that we know from Rogue One. So, you know, his subtly, little bit by little bit, his coats become a bit more tailored. He's less hiding. He's revealing himself a little more, perhaps longer lines. The shoulders square out. So it's this very subtle subliminal transformation that he's going through. So it's things like that, like how do clothes make me feel? What do they say about what I'm trying to achieve in this scene? How I'm feeling on this day? All of those very personal tweaks I incorporate into my costume design work.
James from Jedi News here. So to Michael, I'd like to ask, please, about Cyril's unique costuming and the way that he tailors all his own costumes, because, I mean, obviously there's a big thing made about that in the show, and I'm just wondering if there's anything more to that, because it's, I mean, obviously it's very much part of his character, but it comes across, and it's, you know. And then to Luke, obviously, I loved your work on Chernobyl, and you know, that was incredible. And I see quite a lot of what you did there is very, very similar in Andor, because you're seeing people up front and personal, some of the things that you've already described. So how do you go about coming from a show like that to Star Wars? What's the juxtaposition there, and how did you go about that into you know, coming off something as big as that, where you're telling a real story, into something like this?
Michael, do you want to go first?
I'll go first. I'm really glad you picked up on the Primo uniforms, because I really enjoyed creating them. Usually uniforms are like that, exactly that. They're uniform and everyone looks the same in them. But with Preox, I wanted to explore that, even within a uniform, people find ways of expressing themselves. And so we have the schlumpy guys that are working out in the bullpen, those jaded office workers that are just like not at all engaged, and they are, we sort of enzyme washed their costumes so they were faded out and not ironed, and no pride in their appearance. At the other end of the spectrum, you have Cyril, who tailors, he makes his costumes, he makes small tweaks to them, personalizes them so that they're more expressive of what he wants to project and who he wants to be. So he's got this very fastidious approach to costuming. So we made his costume subtly more, more rigid, more sculpted, freshly pressed, a slightly brighter color. So even within this world of uniforms, we're hopefully able to do a bit of storytelling about the different people in the scene.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, so I guess the short answer is the process is the same with every project, whatever it is. The similarities between doing a project like Chernobyl and a Star Wars project generally, I think, is that there's a lot of research. It's almost like researching a period or an event. There's a lot. I mean, there's an endless amount in Star Wars. It's a life of its own. It really is. It's like, so you want to distill that, but you don't want to get lost in it. In the same way with Chernobyl, you want to distill a mood without getting lost in being documentarian completely. So, I mean, Chernobyl's, although fantastically rewarding, incredibly hard, but the difference there was, I guess we had 5 very fleshed out scripts. When we started Star Wars, Tony was taking it on at the same time I just started, so we were literally building it at the same time as he was writing. But still, I think, yeah, it's the same principle. So it's about, it's about character and environment and storytelling, and then it's about mood and tone. And so with Chernobyl, it was like you could tell the story 1,000 different ways, but it has to have a tone, which, otherwise, yeah, you can make a documentary, but we're making drama. And the same with this. It's like we wanted this to have an almost sort of or journalistic logic. So you approach it like you're dealing with building up every character's reality, and yet at the same time we're making obviously fiction, obviously a drama. So in that sense, I don't think there's any difference. I obviously the material's a lot lighter, well, at times, on Star Wars, but and the worlds are much greater and more varied. It both were rabbit holes, to be honest, from a design point of view. And I think the biggest thing they have in common is that I never felt like you only ever run out of time. I could layer these sets for much longer. I could create, I'd love to go further, but you run out of time and you have to shoot them at some point. So I don't know. It's actually been hugely enjoyable to work on or play in the sandpit of Star Wars, because it's not something I expected to do. Certainly not something I expected to do next. I do really appreciate how different it is in terms of its actual source material, but also how actually freeing it's been to be able to do it in a way that is okay. But I don't know. I mean, like, I'm going to say we wanted it to be fresh, and hopefully we've achieved some semblance of that. That's been both the challenge and the satisfaction, if that makes sense.
Evening all, Mark from Fantatrax here.
Hello.
There's a lot of real world locations in Andor. You filmed in Cleveland. There's stuff round by the Barbican. I was walking around the other day and found some of the places there. When location scouting's done and your work's done, what's the consideration for making it work as a location, work for ILM, work for easy access? Is there a lot of different things you've got to factor in, or do you just literally look and go, I like that corridor, I want us to film down there and work in? How does it work?
Certainly not the latter. I think it goes back to like when we put this project together, we were offering things up as well as designs. We were offering up locations. I love working on building on location, and we ideally would have done a lot more. It's quite hard to take such a large unit on location, but it's also quite hard, especially when you're doing a pandemic. So we kind of ended up building a lot more than maybe we initially intended. But there was sort of some basic principles, really. I didn't want to do a desert, but I wanted something where the landscape spoke for itself. And so like, well, what if we had a planet that felt like the Scottish Highlands, you know? So that was a good starting point and then we were looking at dams, and we found one in particular that always just felt like such a blight on the landscape. They're gonna love me for saying that. It just felt very imperial as a kind of logic. And so that whole Aldani sequence came based around that idea that was an imperial stronghold there, and so on and so on and so on. And so it's actually quite a big question, because Coruscant, like I said, was one of the hardest things we had to do. And at Barbican, I've always felt had both the weight and the texture that felt right for a mega city like Coruscant, but also felt right for a certain level, the mid-level of Coruscant. Obviously there is work within there, but we never sort of approached the location on the basis of, you know, we didn't concept something. And Moen, who's the VFX supervisor, who's like literally with us from day one, like he is a massive part of this show, has great taste. So it's never led by that. It's always about how can we enhance this real place, or how can we put it within the wider world of Coruscant? How can we do shots that you would do in a real city and not in a CGI environment? So it's like, it's a huge question, but you know, like I always said that the best place to shoot Coruscant would be Paris, because you've got both the scale and the sort of the style of certain aspects of Coruscant. It's slim pickings in London, I've got to tell you. But and then I don't know. I mean, is that getting close to answering your question?
I think so. It just struck me as we were walking around. There was, you know, you'd literally turn around. There was one corridor there that we turned around when Vel and Clayla met, and then there's the steps when they had the meeting, and then you walk a little bit and there's the corridor, and you just picked like a doorway, literally just a doorway, and everything else was changed. I was just thinking of you guys walking around thinking that doorway looks good, that corridor looks good.
I mean, basically, yeah, with the Barbican, yeah, you're a little more limited, you're a little bit more like what's the targeted, I suppose. Yeah. But I guess what I was always looking for when piecing together Coruscant was journeys. So again, it wasn't like, oh, let's stand here and have a conversation with the city in the background or something like that. So Barbican actually gives you a lot in terms of journeys. The Cyril going home is one of my favorites, I think. That's I can't remember the name of the place now. That's in London, and it's like a brutalist estate. And yeah, I mean, all we really did was sort of make it go much further down and give it that elevation and that sort of sense of depression, I suppose. But yeah, it's really hard. Like, I want to shoot more on location. More often than not, we pull back from doing a location. We use location as an inspiration. I mean, for me, location scouting is one of the most inspiring things to do. But the yeah, I mean, look, our location manager Rich, he's worked very hard to find things that feel, or at least have the bones of Star Wars, and then we kind of go from there.
Magic. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm ready now for the British spin-off podcast with both of you guys. Yeah, Alden and Nikki here with Octo Radio, and we're both so interested in the growth that's happening in both of your respective fields, Luke and Michael, and how that's expanding.
Yeah, so like with the volume, for example, dominating so many sort of entertainment conversations, what are some perhaps under-discussed artistic or technological innovations in the world of production and costume design that we may not know about, but played a huge role in creating Andor?
Oh, Michael, do you want to go first? Because I know you've got a...
Yeah, interesting question. I think for me, because we were kind of leaning heavily into the DNA of the look of the Star Wars established costume language, it's actually quite an analog costume, approach. Well, it's a mixture, in fact. Like, there is things that would have been groundbreaking in 1977 as far as the costumes go, that seem not so groundbreaking now. But we kind of liked to have that as a starting point. We had a similar approach with this one. There were lots of handmade, like old school analog created costumes, but we also have a fantastic costume props department that is using new technologies, new materials to create mostly armored elements or small sculpted elements that you see on costuming. There's lots of 3D printing that happens, scanning of things and then adapting things. We're constantly trying new urethanes and different materials that might make more comfortable armor. We made a lot of the problem with the original Stormtroopers is that they changed color over time. The white of the originals turned yellow over the years. And it was also quite rigid and difficult to do certain stunt-like moves in. So yeah, we explored some new materials to make our Stormtroopers that would stay white forever and that would be comfortable for our stunt people to wear. So yeah, it's a very beautiful and organic mixture of analog and new costume making techniques.
I would fully agree with that. I'd say we're not back to basics. No, we're not doing anything groundbreaking in the art department here, but I think just it was an active choice not to use the volume. It doesn't suit our goal. It certainly doesn't suit Tony's writing. So the idea is to be on the ground and moving around with the characters as much as possible, not creating sort of spaces for scenes to happen in, if that makes sense. So actually it's just something that actually can do more with a long episodic drama like this, or multi-episodic drama. You build just bigger sets that you can just connect them up. I mean, it's sort of I think Ferrix was comprised of almost 30 sets. They're all largely out on the back lot as one large composite set, so you could literally walk down North Street, round onto the main street, down there, round to Marvers, into Marvers. You know, that process was, although complex, was very enjoyable. And I suppose the most sort of modern part of that is that, like with any of the sets, I would usually just start by designing the whole thing. So design the city, design the prison in full, design, and then start to break it down and what we want to use, what bits we want to build. At least then we understand the full geography. We understand our rules. And I think that filters through, even if you don't see it all, it doesn't hopefully jar at any point. So then, I mean, and then a huge element of that is like, you know, if you're going to go that step, we sort of model everything. It was actually, that was another thing we did on Chernobyl. We built the whole power plant and sort of worked out what we actually needed to physically make. And sorry, built it in 3D, should I say, not and likewise with Ferrix, and then we can kind of previs from that. So a director, when we got many directors, can start to actually plan, because you know the set's not going to be standing there for them to plan on. There's not really, we don't follow a pipeline like they do over on Manhattan Beach for the volume shows at all. We don't have that aspect. We're much more, I suppose, analog is kind of, you know, then that feeds into what we wanted to achieve. You know, we wanted it to feel a little bit like the original movies in the sense that it was tangible, more like that. So and yeah, I don't think there's anything groundbreakingly new about what we're doing, other than that we are trying to do it more I don't know, trying to compile all the resources to put more on the screen, but make it feel like it's less.
There's
Someone
no,
asked me that earlier,
yet, like the Luke Hall technique has not been coined yet.
I mean, if there is, I haven't figured it out yet. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm still working out how to do my job with every project, and that's part of the beauty of my job and why I enjoy it. I think once I've figured out how to do it, I'll be bored of it. So like I said, the complexity with this is that you've got so many other facets. You've got creatures, special effects, sliding doors, you know, vehicles that have to hover or whatever. So everything has to be designed. I think that's the thing that sometimes gets forgotten with this. We're not, like I said, we're in our ambition to not select from the catalog. We have set ourselves a huge task that everything has to be designed and made. So, and that there's no mystery to it. I just have a very good team. Full of very, very skilled and clever people around me, and I yes, I'm hugely humble to them for being able to achieve a show like Andor.